Recording for this meeting has begun.
Again, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another session of the NICR webcast series. Our presentation today is highlights of the 2021 Urban Mobility Report. Our presenter will be Dr. Bill Isley, and Bill is a senior research engineer at the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, where he leads the mobility division. He is a recognized expert in the areas of mobility analysis, freight mobility, urban freight transportation, performance measurement, and access management. For over 26 years, Dr. Isley has performed research on a variety of industry and public agency sponsors. Dr. Isley is a co-author of TTI's Urban Mobility Report, which provides mobility statistics and trends for metropolitan areas throughout the United States. With that, Dr. Isley, I'm going to hand the presentation over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Stephanie. How's our audio?
It sounds fantastic.
Very good. All right, well, let's dive right in then. So appreciate the opportunity. And yes, I'm going to give you some of the highlights of our report that we released about a month ago or thereabouts. Before I jump too far into that, I want to recognize all of our sponsors. Certainly the National Institute for Congestion Research, NICR, who provided funding for this. Also the Texas Department of Transportation, who helped to sponsor this report, and then to our data provider, NRIX. So what is this report? This is a report where we evaluate mobility conditions in urban areas throughout the United States, and we look at both the freeways and principal arterial street networks in that analysis. And we have a bunch of different urban areas that we look at. We've got 101 urban areas that we look at a little bit more detailed. They're the larger locations. They're the locations where we have data that go back to 1982, our earliest data. And then we have a number of smaller locations, nearly 400 of them, where we've got a data trend for the last 6 or 7 years. And we use a suite of performance measures. I'll touch on a few. I certainly won't be able to get into all of them because it's important to look at a bunch of different performance measures because they collectively tell the story a little bit better than one or two, which may only cover one or two aspects of the larger story. So big headlines, what did we find? We found that, not terribly surprising, that the 2020 congestion costs and travel delays were down in 2019. What was a little striking is just how much they were down, particularly when we look at what happened in the March, April, May, when there were the standing orders and stay-at-home orders, excuse me. But still, on looking at annual numbers, everything dropped essentially in half. You've no doubt already started to look at the numbers that are up on the screen, which are a few of the more common measures we look at. We typically start by looking at the delay. So this annual delay per auto commuter went from 54 hours to 27 hours in 2020, so virtually half the wasted fuel associated with that. And then what's that cost per auto commuter? What's that mean? Was also cut in half to $605. So that cost is wasted time and fuel due to the congestion. And so you can see it's 27 hours, still, one thing we'll say is that's still like 3 vacation days stuck in traffic, or 3 8-hour days stuck in traffic throughout the year. So it is still there, but certainly not nearly what we had in 2019. The other aspect of this is we look at more area-wide numbers, and these are kind of just the big hairy numbers of how much delay was there, how much wasted fuel, what's the overall cost, and then we also have this measure of the extra CO2 as well. But again, same story here. You can see all of these numbers essentially drop down to about half, and that top line, that 4.3 billion hours, that was similar to what we saw back in 1997. So you have to go back 20 plus years to see those kind of numbers in our data set. And then, like good researchers, we've peeled these data back a number of different ways. I mentioned that it was a 50% reduction or thereabouts. One thing that's interesting in that 27 hours of delay per auto commuter that I mentioned, we only had, in kind of call it a normal congestion year, 2019, we only had 5 areas that had less than 30 hours. In 2020, we had 73 of those areas. So substantial sort of across the board reduction in traffic. If you're geeky like me, you might be interested in looking at that graphic, which shows, across different urban area sizes, where did we see locations that had less than 30? And you can see right away it's the large, mediums. Well, naturally there's more in those groups as well, but that's where we were seeing a lot of those. What was really interesting also in the data set in 2020 is it's almost like we had 4 unique 2020s in congestion. We kind of had 4 unique years of congestion. If you look at this graph, this is the change in congestion from 2019 in terms of the total delay we had and what did we have in 2020. So early on, January, February, things were kind of normalish as expected. It looked about like 2019, but then we got those stay-at-home orders and things really shut down, and call it March, especially April, a little bit still into May, and it looked more like 1991 in terms of those large declines. And then we so slowly and kind of steadily went back up to what we might call as the normal congestion, but we ended the year still 15 years behind what we might expect, because clearly those congestion levels were increasing before everything was shut down. Then we certainly flattened the virus curve, or while we were attempting to flatten that virus curve, we certainly flattened this congestion curve. And what we've done here is we've looked at the hours of the day. So across the day, 0 to 24 hours, what was the trend in terms of where that delay was occurring? 2019, again, back to what was a little bit more normal. You could see the peaks in the traffic. Then 2020, it's kind of looks like an eroded mountains over the millennia from water and wind and other erosion, just brought it entirely down. And we see that the morning peak period essentially is gone. It's just not there. The afternoon was probably about, it's a little bit less than half of what we had in 2019, but it really kind of speaks volumes. And I think when we think back to our experiences in 2020, we can kind of realize that, okay, those of us that had the ability to work from home, or may have had small children, you just weren't running around as much in the morning, but it was the afternoon perhaps when you were making some of those trips. And certainly there was a little bit more flexibility than when we commuted. As a parent who had kids at home in the virtual world, we just had to get out of the house come afternoon and stretch our legs and not be at home. So there's just a bunch of different types of travel occurring out there on the system. So that's when the actual delay occurred. What's interesting is when we look at this from what was the percent of the delay by hour of the day. And here you can really start to see how we have essentially much lower again in 2020. But we also start to see that shift in the percentage of the delay occurring to the off peaks. Midday, for example, you got 6 hours there that were higher in 2020 than 2019. And you can sort of see just a little bit of that in the evening as well. Some of it shifting to the evening. Even if you look very, very way early morning at the leftmost part of the curve, I was actually noticing this the other day, and it's a tiny bit higher. It's not very much higher, but I think all of this speaks to when we looked further at some of the truck data as well. A lot of the trucks and even people, we were shifting away from those peak periods. Those trucks had to make sure that those essential goods were still getting out. And I think that's what we're picking up here in this information. And I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. So that's the day. This is the week. So if you look at the weekend, those delay hours, orange bar on the Saturday and Sunday compared to the blue bar is about 70% of what it was in 2019, while Tuesday to Thursday, the orange bars were about 45% of what they were in 2019. So a little bit interesting in terms of how this plays out across the week. When we look at it as a percentage, you see it flip on the weekends, and that is that there's more delay on the weekends than what we had in prior years. And again, I think that's partly trucks and deliveries being made on weekends, but I think it's also, if you think about your travel behaviors, they kind of moved around a little bit, and perhaps weekends you found yourself needing to get out or took the time to get out a little bit more than perhaps we had done in the past. That was the week. This is the urban area. So if you look across all the different urban area sizes, and you can see the different size ranges and population on the x-axis there, this tremendous drop in traffic from the red bar to the green bar from 2019 to 2020. Note that the bars are for different years that are not equally distributed. So you go from 82 to 2000. So you've got about 18 years there in that first jump, and then the others are about 9-10 years apart. And that last one is just one year drop. So you can see pretty quickly it was a substantial decline across urban areas, and that largest decline was actually seen in those regions over 3 million. Another way to look at this is by whether the delay is on the street or the freeways, and then whether it was during the peak or the off-peak. There's a lot going on in on these pie graphs, but just know left-hand side is 19 pie chart, 2020 is on the right-hand side, and we're looking at places that are under 1 million population. If you follow the zigzag line, the black line from left to right, you'll see that for smaller communities, the off-peak freeway went from 10% to 18%, while the peak streets went from 43% to 33% delay. So all else is sort of equal, roughly equal on that pie chart. So we're seeing a shift in the smaller communities of the delay from the streets to the freeways. This is the same sort of information for locations of over 1 million population. So again, following the zigzags here, you've got off-peak streets going from 17 to 20% of the delay, off-peak freeways going from 15 to 23 or 26%. So again, the big message here is that we're seeing a lot of the travel moving to the off-peaks, and then this is sort of how that breaks down across the street versus the freeway. Another way to look at this, then we took all of our data points of all of our cities, and we looked at the travel delay difference, the percent difference relative to 2019 and how much it had dropped in 2020. And that across the top is a bluish banner that says the usual amount of annual change. That's kind of what's been typical in terms of the percent change in congestion, and it's generally going up. But you can see here now that it's took a substantial drop, and it varies. It's not just a pretty consistent drop. It varies from 25 to 65%. So big changes amongst different urban areas. And then you can see from left to right how that changes for the different populations groups that we have. We had a exceptionally bright NICR student this summer, intern, looking at why. Looking at a little bit further into this, what kind of census data can we pull in and look at to help us understand the variability in this? And perhaps it was related to the type of employment or employment opportunities or other demographics. So we are excited to learn those insights soon. Another theme from the report is that the truckers kept on trucking. I alluded to this earlier, that the essential goods had to keep on moving through our time of need. These are, you could see the 4 data points here for kind of those 4 different unique parts of the calendar year of 2020 that we experienced. On the left is all traffic volumes. So you can see by population size how much travel dropped, how much the traffic volumes kind of dropped. So you can see we started at kind of at normal levels, and we went down with stay-at-home orders and then started to bounce back up. But the truckers on the right-hand side barely had much of an impact in terms of what they saw, and they were pretty steady delivering the goods throughout 2020. This graphic presents it's admittedly a little tough to read here. There's a lot going on, and in fact, it looks like it may not have transferred very well, because what we had done is tried to cut this in half to not show quite all that detail, but may not have come through on the slides too well. But I encourage you to take a look at it on the in the report itself, and it shows down below the all vehicles versus trucks, what those reductions were in the number of or percentages of vehicles. So we started off around 100%, and then it drops down. That middle bar is when we had the stay-at-home orders. So on average, dropping 34% and then climbing back up, but still down about 14% compared to 2019. And then the trucks dropped down to, on average, about as much as 12%, and then rose back up to perhaps only 4% down. And that's an average, and that's annual. So certainly it dropped down more during the stay-at-home orders, and certainly if you look out the window, no matter where you're sitting, your numbers probably weren't average unless you're real lucky. You may have seen things not drop down as much. You may have seen more trucks rolling or less trucks. So I'm not going to go into that graphic quite as much because it's a little tough to make out, but we were trying to make a visual illustration, and then also to show just anecdotally how some of those trip types, what some of those trip types may have been for the different vehicles in those different traffic streams, to help relate it back to some of our own experiences as we lived through 2020. You heard my introduction that I dabble in the truck world and do quite a bit of research in the freight area. So I wanted to dwell on this topic just a little bit more. There's really nothing like the empty shelves where the toilet paper should be and disinfecting wipes and water should be, to help you all pay attention more to trucking and supply chains and goods movement. So I point out that all of us in this industry and in this business and opportunity have this opportunity to shine a light on that and help people understand kind of the importance of this and what was really happening in our transportation industry at that time. I've touched on this already, how they shifted to the off-peak periods. Here's a couple of e-commerce statistics that just show why I think we saw what we saw. Online sales were about 21% in 2020. That's a 16% jump over what was occurring in 2019, and drastically higher than what we've seen in the past before that. 2020, we almost hit $1 billion in online spending, about 44% over what we saw in 2019. And I think we can all relate to that, and we were all probably guilty of clicking add to cart and purchase, perhaps more last year than we're used to. And I think that among many other behaviors is one that's probably going to hold on for quite some time. I think we've sped up our e-commerce and delivery. We probably shot into the future a few years, just given how much there's been, and that's going to have implications on the system. A little bit later, we'll talk a little bit about what happens next with the future, but as it relates to trucks and next day deliveries, the implications are going to be that trucks going to have their products closer to the customers when you click purchase in order to hit their delivery dates, which is what they care about. So that may mean distribution centers moving closer to urban areas, more trucks on the road, more importance to curb management and things particularly in our urban areas, and all these other implications that I would love to talk about more, but in the interest of time, I'll move on. So we congestion reduction strategies. So what is the solution or the fix for congestion? And I think it's an important conversation to have. Congestion was certainly coming back towards the end of 2020. I think depending upon where you're at, there's probably some congestion growth in your community that is occurring now. But it's kind of inevitable that it's going to come back. I think it's important to keep in mind congestion doesn't have just one cause, so there isn't going to be one solution. And for decades, we've always had a number of solutions that we've documented, and we've always recommended this balanced and diversified approach to reducing the congestion, and that is really more of everything is needed. We certainly will expect that congestion will come back. It's clearly through 2019, we had seen that the investments in some of the solutions out there weren't keeping pace with the growing problem because the congestion was still growing. But on the hopeful side, state DOTs, planners, employers, employees have seen the strength of things like telework programs, biking, walking modes, as well as some of the societal benefits of for providing workers with some more job location flexibility. So I think that's all in play. It's certainly important for us to keep in mind the context and the local community goals as a starting point when we're starting to look at what some of these possible solutions are. But with that, here's a couple. First off, getting as much as possible from the system that's out there. We've made some investment in the transportation system that we see when we look out into out our windows and drive down our roads, and it's important for us to get the best investment out of that. That might look like making sure that traffic signals are timed properly and as well as possible to get as much throughput, and also balancing the pedestrian and bicycles on those networks to make the system as a whole operate as well as possible. Could also mean something as simple as getting traffic crashes out of the way just as quickly as possible. Providing choices, allowing trip customization by travelers. We all benefit by having some options in terms of how travelers, shippers can make their trips in terms of when and where and in what form, and how that might change throughout the day or day to day. Some days you've got to get into the office, or some days or got to get home faster if it's your daughter's rehearsal evening. So maybe you're willing to pay a little bit more for a more reliable trip. Other days it might be your turn to mow the lawn, so you're not in such a hurry to get home. We've seen a lot with commuting and work schedule options as well this year, and the benefits to some of those programs. So I think that's certainly in play as well. Technology advances. As we become more connected with our vehicles and our society becomes more connected, we're going to have systems that are communicating and helping us with some of those efficiencies. And I think that can certainly help us to inform and to plan for better mobility of our smart cities well into the future. In some cases, we'll need to add capacity. That could be new or expanded public transportation facilities, larger bus, rail fleets, and in some cases, streets, highways as well. And I think certainly some of that more will also include better paths, routes for bikes and pedestrians. So again, always with a multimodal consciousness as we talk about some of these different solutions. Another is diversifying our development patterns. I think it's the theory here is as we can get more and more developments to be closer together, well, that will compress the location of where we live, where we work, perhaps where we recreate. That can minimize the VMT on the transportation system. It's equally important that we've got to keep in mind that all of those home and job location choices are the result of choices we all make related to family needs, perhaps our education preferences, where the schools are, our entertainment, cultural sites that allow us to, and where we can recreate. But keeping all that in mind will allow planners and other professionals to sort of adjust the projects and policies so that we can do this when it's possible. We also, at some level, just need to have realistic expectations. You can't expect to work downtown and live in the suburbs of LA and leave at 5 o'clock and get home expeditiously. It's just not the world that we live in. I think what's important that we do keep in mind, though, is congestion probably doesn't need to be an all-day event. It doesn't need to be an all-day event, period. There are things that we can do to, again, minimize those peak periods, reduce those peak periods, operating the system a little bit better in order to keep those things in check. This is the last one I snuck in, being a responsible consumer, traveler. As I reflect on kind of this last year, especially, I often hear that there's too many trucks on the road, or there's people in the way and can't get around. Well, I ask those people, do you eat anything? Do you ever buy anything ever? Because those trucks are meeting those demands and those needs. So I think the idea here is just looking for opportunities to minimize impacts on the system, understanding that your purchases you make probably be on a truck eventually, thinking about, can I combine my shipments, or can I do some of my trips myself to minimize that VMT in some way. And similarly, it gets back to having those mobility options for some of the travel that you may want to do. How do we estimate the congestion? So stepping back and thinking about methodology, now that I've touched on kind of what some of the results were and some of the possible solutions, how do we estimate the solution? Well, or how do we estimate the congestion? We look at speed data points for every 15-minute period of the week for pretty much every mile of major roadway in the United States. That's about 1 billion speeds, or really more than 1 billion speeds, spread out across 1.5 million miles of U.S. streets and highways. And so on the one hand, we have streets, and then we couple that with the volume and roadway inventory that's available from FHWA, the Highway Performance Management System, or excuse me, monitoring system. And when we couple speeds and volumes together, then we can start to compute delays and look at the delay for each of these different time periods and compare that with what we're seeing in low volume conditions. The volume's really important because it allows us to get a scale of the problem and make sure that we're not treating like a 2-lane road the same as a 10-lane freeway in terms of the volume that it carries. They're just totally different items. A little bit more information on this. We use the free flow. Speeds are used for a baseline, and I think it's important here to talk a little bit about this, because why we use the free flow is because that really, to us, defines really the full extent of the congestion problem. And there's some who have suggested or wondered or asked, we get this question quite a bit about why base everything on the free flow, and why not have something lower than that, because we certainly don't want to design for free flow. Well, then we're having a conversation about how much of the congestion do we really want to fix. So what could be a target speed? So in our world, what we would suggest is the best thing to do is use free flow, because you define the full extent of the problem. Then it's more of a local decision, rightfully and democratically, to identify, okay, how much of that do we want to fix? How much of that delay is unacceptable? And that could vary between urban areas and within even an urban area. So it's kind of a two-part consideration. So methodologically, I think it feels a little bit presumptuous at best, and perhaps even arrogant at worst, to assume that we could know and place these targets on urban areas without the local input and the context for the travel goals that those urban areas want to follow. In many cases, then you're starting to turn congestion into a math problem, and we could certainly fix all the congestion by picking a target where it just goes away. But that probably wouldn't meet local goals and probably wouldn't be appropriate. The other thing is if you do something like that, then we're cheating ourselves out of telling the full story of the amount of congestion that's out there on the system. And when we do that, if we have projects that provide benefits, multimodal benefits across all modes in our city, we may not be able to capture the full investment benefit from those things. So that's just a couple of thoughts on that. And certainly people can relate to free flow and what it means when we talk about that as well. And I touched on that a little bit. One thing that's also unique about allowing the data to power this is it really empowers the data to tell us what the off-peak speeds are for a specific roadway. If you think about your HCM back when I was in engineering and planning school way back in the day, we used to have to adjust and use a bunch of factors to help us identify what was the traffic level and what we could expect to happen on the roads out there. And in this, given perhaps what the driveway density is, or given what other geometric or operational considerations are out there, in this way, it just lets the data tell us essentially what that is. And it provides a consistent way to do it across each urban area. Again, we're looking at nearly 500 urban areas, so certainly we can't get to the point where we're trying to get local knowledge in each of these and tweak all of them. We did do a quick analysis here using the free flows and looking at, we don't have the speed limit data. That might be a good place to start if it were available nationwide in a data set. But like I said, one of the questions we get about, what if you're picking free flow speeds that might be above the speed limit a little bit, you're adding in a little extra delay, and we found that with these numbers here that maybe only 2.5% of the delay is within that free flow, and maybe 10% to 10 or 11% of that delay is occurring above 45 miles per hour. So it's not a substantial amount. I think what's more telling and what's important to keep in mind here is that when we've got speeds that are low, much lower, and in high volume, that's really when we're cranking out more of the more of the delay and seeing more of that delay. Speed limit's got some of its own issues, and that's a different conversation too, because some of those can be set politically and aren't always necessarily updated in inventory data sets and such too. But so those are a few other considerations there. So I'll move on from that. We could talk at length about that, but I've got a lot of other important things I want to talk about too. The measures. If you're reading a guidebook, it always says how to use this guidebook. Well, this is our how to use this guide. It's important to use all of our measures and to look at all of the measures really to evaluate many of the different types of problems, because some of the problems are intended to fix things sort of all day. Some are focused more on peaks, and some are travel demand management strategies. So it's important to look at kind of this suite of measures. It's important to compare areas that have a similar population and not just throw everything into one big pile. Long-term trends are the best indicators of change, especially given what has happened here in 2020 and what we've observed recently. And here are some of those measures. These are, and you've seen a couple of these, at least on the opening slides that I had. We have measures that focus both on the individual, so it helps people understand, auto commuters can understand exactly what they might be experiencing on the road. And then we have more of the area-wide measures, which is the next slide. So an important distinction here, delay per auto commuter is all day. So all of our, and that's kind of the one we really focus on is delay. And the reason is we're capturing delay 24/7, 365, both peaks and off peaks in order to tell that complete story. Sometimes you'll see us also talk about the travel time index, which is a ratio of the peak to the off peak travel time. So if it's a 1.2, it's 20% more. It takes you 20% longer in the peak than the off-peak. But again, that's only the peak, and it's ignoring everything else. And the wasted fuel, and then the congestion cost, and I think I touched on a couple of those previously. Urban area, national numbers, we have the total delays, we have some of these larger total numbers. I've alluded to a couple of these already, so I'm not going to spend too much more time on that. I did want to talk a little bit about a couple of projects that we have that are starting up with NICR. And this first one, we're looking at accessibility, and really the goal of integrating accessibility into transportation planning is to ensure that congestion mitigation measures can and do encourage transportation equity and urban space livability. Some of the traditional methods that we've looked at have largely focused on modeling or estimation procedures, and what we're going to do is use the actual data and compare that and look at what are those decisions that are being made, and what is
Invalid
the travel that's
entry.
occurring out on the system. And not sure what that was, but I'm assuming everything's okay. I heard something. The point is we'll be using some kind of origin destination real data sets to do this and to develop some suite of measures that we can look at that a little bit closer. The other one is the traffic signal performance, where, as it says, we're developing a regional signal performance measurement methodology.
Your microphone has been turned on.
Data. I'm afraid we've missed. Did some stuff get missed just now? Stephanie or audience?
I think we're okay.
Okay. Okay. Okay. I was getting the Academy Award music in the background, so I wasn't sure. All right. So traffic signal performance is the other one we're going to look at, and there's just so much we can do with these large new data sets that are crowdsourced to look closer at what's happening in the signal cabinet, and using that information with traditional performance measures to dig a little deeper into arterial street delay and how we could plan these systems and integrate them better with non-motorized modes as well. And so I think that holds the promise to provide some additional dimensions to the UMR in the future. So a big question that always comes up is, what does the future hold? And really, it's kind of scratch your head. Does 2020 even matter? and how and why does it matter? I think it does, but I think honestly, hopefully we're coming out of this thing. Hopefully it's behind us. Hopefully we don't experience another pandemic in our lifetimes. So, several years from now, hopefully this is just a kind of a blip in the radar. But I think there are a lot of lessons that are going to come out of this that are going to last for quite some time. While many of us have started, who have had the opportunity, we've sort of taken the time to rethink our personal trip behavior choices, and I think some of that's going to hang on and stay changed for quite some time. It's been a large telecommuting behavioral experiment, if you will. A lot of us, that have had the opportunity to telecommute have benefited from that. Will that continue? We'll see. In some cases, I'm sure it will. Employees employers sometimes are concerned about whether that's okay and if they can monitor staff accordingly. And there are some other employees that are equally concerned about it, just whether they're going to be able to get adequate mentoring and professional development opportunities. And I think certainly all that is yet to be seen in many ways. The other question we're always getting: when and where will the congestion return, and when and how, et cetera. And I think these are sort of the top reasons when and where it's going to come back. Those places that have job increases, population increases, will certainly see their congestion come back. We've for decades seen this relationship between the economics of an area and congestion. And now in the world we're looking at, vaccination rates, I suspect, and comfort level, as those things increase, we'll probably see the additional traffic as well. But there's so many unknowns. There really are when we have this conversation about what we're going to see in the future, and a lot of this is yet to play out. How soon will the employment and the markets bounce back? I think is certainly something that's still yet to be seen. To what extent will office workers continue to work from home? Again, we sort of touched on that in this presentation already. Will the trip departures remain similar? That is sort of moving away from the peaks, and will we get back to those peaks? There's a lot of jobs, we can't forget, where people still need to go in at a certain time and punch in and punch out. So I think a lot of this is yet to be seen how it plays out. Will and when. Hopefully it's a big win. Will the public transportation ridership come back? What are the effects of these transportation and land use changes that we're going to see as people rethink perhaps where they live and work and how they work and how they recreate? And then on top of that, how is the business community going to adjust to those behavioral changes? Where and how will businesses get to their employers and get to people who can work at their businesses? As one example, how will brick and mortars adjust their physical assets and in this world of e-commerce in order to stay competitive, and what's that look like on land use? And then as a bit of a freight guy on top of that, when all that starts to play out, then on top of that, we need to think about where and when and how are we going to get those goods and services supplied to those people and businesses on top of that. And obviously, I'm only just scratching the surface here. But I'm going to start moving towards the end here. I think that was essentially the last slide of content. Here are the websites of interest, our website for our report on the top and data for your city, and a really cool visualization where you can go in and interactively see some of the changes and take a look at the congestion, et cetera, and more interactively and visually. And then a website for our mobility division here at TTI, and then finally my contact information. And so I'm happy. I think now is the time to take some questions, have some discussion, and we can go from there.
Thank you so much, Bill. I did want to just quickly note that the links that Bill has provided at the end of his presentation are also included in the web link section up at the top right-hand corner of your screen. So all you would do to visit any of those links is just click on the link, and that will open directly for you. You also have access, as a reminder, to the files or download section of Adobe Connect, which is located immediately below your web links. If you would like to download a copy of today's presentation, it is included. So, Bill, looks like we've got a number of questions that have been submitted. So let's start with our discussion. So your question and box is located, for those, as a reminder, in the bottom right-hand corner. So, Bill, this is the first question. It says, I think I briefly saw a measure related to greenhouse gas emissions. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that measurement?
Yeah, I had to go through that fairly quickly here, but we do compute the excess greenhouse gas emissions that are due to congestion, and then also the total emissions that are produced based upon the traffic congestion. Because there is a direct relationship between those emissions and fuel use, it really helps us to power our measures of the fuel used, and also it's a good measure to help us better understand some of the environmental impacts of the congestion, and not only of the congestion, but what is happening just sort of in the free flow across the entire network as well.
Great, thank you. The next question is a multi-part question, so I'll read both parts. It says, what are mobility analyses like the UMR important, or why are they important? And what do these national and urban area statistics help us do?
I think what it does is it helps us to really define the problem. What is the full extent of the congestion problem? You know, if you look out there, you know, it's certainly a multimodal transportation network that we have. You know, 85% of people are commuting by auto, so I think it's pretty. Um, in we do our industry an injustice by not taking a look at that and looking at what some of the solutions to that are. But more specifically, then we can start a conversation once we know the full extent of the problem on what are some of the possible solutions and what makes sense at different levels, the national, state, local levels. Um, or recently, Chair DeFazio actually mentioned, he's chair of the House Committee on Transportation Infrastructure, mentioned some of our work while they were debating the infrastructure bill. So it gets some, you know, it's good to see how that can influence and start to say, okay, here's how big this problem is, and then we can begin the discussion about what sorts of funding is needed and what sorts of solutions make sense at different levels. I think what's also is important is it gives us an opportunity, and we've done a lot of research across different modes to look into different performance measures to identify um, similar mobility analyses measures and apply our measures across modes, whether that's for transit and also looking at non-motorized modes as well. We've looked at total travel time measures in the past, which look irrespective of how you travel, what's your door-to-door travel times from, you know, being 20 seconds across the house to a 20-minute drive across town. And I think looking at all of these things is important. And in many ways, we've got the science and the measures and the methods there. We're just waiting for some of the data on some of these other modes for it to catch up. But we would love to be able to produce a report. You know, that's kind of the holy grail, right? One day that captures effectively across all modes what's the mobility in different locations.
Thank you so much. This next question comes in and says, how do you account for induced demand in your research? Is this considered in the environmental impact reporting of congestion?
So the induced demand for people that don't know, you know, is if you build it, they will come, right? It's the folks that are out there on the sidelines that may want to use the system and can't, perhaps because it is congested. There's something that Tony Downs, there's a concept called triple convergence that Tony Downs talked about in traffic, and then his book, Still Stuck in Traffic, where he talks about when you add some, when the congestion is lifted, people will either change when they travel or perhaps the mode of how they travel or where they travel. So they may be induced, they may move over to a particular road from one road once the congestion is freed up on a corridor. And so in our data and the data that we collect, it's at a system level. So what's important is a lot of that induced demand is a project by project or policy or even you know, is whatever may be inducing that traffic. So when we look at a system level, we are able to look at what is that total impact perhaps across the area. And with the urban mobility report, we're looking at large numbers across an urban area as opposed to corridor specifics, but we have done some of that in the past. So I think what's nice here, long story short, if it's not too late, what's nice here is the data again tell us what's occurring on the transportation system. And maybe it still looks congested after, but if we start to also in a very congested location, we can also start to look at, okay, well, have we had impacts on the peak period travel? Perhaps the peak periods are shrinking. Perhaps there's more movement from the off peaks to the peaks.
Great. Here's the next question. It says, how do you respond to the criticism that the urban mobility... Go ahead, I apologize.
I was just going to say, I saw it was a two-parter. Is this considered in the environmental impact reporting of congestion? And so, yes, it is, to the extent that, you know, we collect the data that's from the crowdsourced data source, and then we run it through all of our performance measures, including the emissions.
Okay. I thought you wrapped up both questions in once, and I do apologize. So let's get to the next question.
Sure.
It says, how do you respond to criticism that the urban mobility report should be renamed the traffic congestion report, since it only considers one aspect of mobility, automotive traffic congestion, and overlooks all other aspects of urban mobility, such as walkability, bicycling level of service, public transit service quality, and land use accessibility?
Well, a couple of thoughts. I don't know that I would, well, I think it's important that we keep in mind, you know, we're looking at urban mobility as a whole. And as I just talked about earlier, we would love to produce something where we can look across modes and identify, have the data and the information, because we have the methods to look at ways to capture these other modes. So that's essentially at the ready, and we've developed some of those total travel time measures, like I said, but I think we do our industry a huge injustice by ignoring 90% of commuters or thereabouts that are out there using the auto mode. I mean, it is an important mode out there. Sure, we can make changes to that, and we encourage it. Everybody who listened to me just now heard my extensive discussion of what the solutions are, but context is really important, and a lot of people just don't have options in terms of how and when they travel. You know, a lot of people are fortunate enough to be able to have that flexibility, but some just don't, and I think it's disingenuous of us to ignore that populace.
Great, thank you, Belle. It doesn't look like we have any additional questions at this time, so what I will do is I will open up the evaluation for you on your end. If you could take a few moments to complete that very short evaluation, as it is very not only important to our presenter today, but the entire NICR, or National Institute for Congestion Reduction webinar series. We will be back in a few short weeks to talk about pricing mechanisms for managed lanes. So on behalf of the National Center for Congestion Reduction, thank you so much to Dr. Isley and for the presentation today, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Bye, everybody.